when I set off from Croydon to drive around the world in a van that I picked out of the scrapyard and was running on used cooking oil, whether I'd be able to find enough fuel, whether the engine would hold together. But I think it's important to take that first step. Okay, so my background, I've done a number of trips which could be described as sustainable. I've driven around the world in a truck that I pulled out of a scrapyard and converted to run on used cooking oil. So I was scavenging used cooking oil from the back of restaurants in countries all the way around the world to power that journey. I've driven probably most famously to Timbuktu in a chocolate-powered lorry. So that was fuel made from chocolate. A biodiesel that was made from waste chocolate. Who knew there was such a thing as waste chocolate? I've also organised rallies for cars running on used cooking oil across Europe. We called it the Grease to Greece Rally. And then sort of away from vehicles, I've cycled across South America. I've sailed from Greece to New Zealand, and I've paraglided around the Himalayas. So these are all kind of ways I've explored of travelling around without using fossil fuels, and this very much sets me up in that kind of do-gooder, sustainable eco-hero that's going to make everybody feel guilty about taking the weekend break to Barcelona, and that's really not what I'm about. These trips have all kind of come around, as I say, as experiments to see if there's a way of doing what I enjoy doing in a more sustainable way. And the inspiration, where it started off, not even really about carbon footprints, it's more about social justice. So I used to buy old MOT failed cars in Germany, and I used to drive them down through Europe and across the Sahara Desert and sell them in West Africa. And these trips were a great way of exploring parts of the world that I hadn't seen before and learning about other parts of the world. And there was a sort of, I like to post-rationalize that there was a sustainable element in that I was recycling these vehicles. But the reality was, they tended to be big 4x4s, big gas guzzlers. And came a point where I was in Mali in 2008, and there was a place where there's basically a bus line that runs across the whole country, and this is the lifeblood of the country. And I was in a small village, and a bus pulled up, and all these ladies come running to the bus to sell their wares. And this bus is not only a transport lifeline, but it's an economic lifeline. So it's a way of money coming in and out of the village. And at the time, in 2008, oil price had hit $100 a barrel. It was the highest it had ever been. And a lot of the buses couldn't afford to run because the cost of fuel was so expensive. And I was sitting on the bonnet of my gas guzzling 4x4, and it kind of occurred to me that my contribution to the supply and demand curve of crude oil was part of the big sort of wheels that are turning to make that situation. And one of the consequences was that in this tiny village, people were feeling that economic burden. So that's really where my interest in initially biofuels and then later sustainable travel in all sorts came about. It was more sort of from a social justice point of view. So these days I kind of talk about those trips. I talk about the experiments that I've done, the journeys that I've done, how each one has led to the next sort of iteration of thinking of, all right, well, that sort of worked and that didn't work, so what's the next step? As well as the sort of different technologies and different means of travel, I've also kind of evolved in my thinking of what sustainability actually means. My favorite definition is that sustainability is about ensuring the needs of future generations without compromising the needs of people today. So there's quite a lot in that short sentence. Specifically, there's this idea of needs rather than wants. So often this idea that the environmental do-gooders just want everyone to be miserable and just have just your needs and nothing more than that. But there's also a kind of important idea of ensuring people's needs today. And I think often in the sustainability debate, that gets lost, and people feel threatened by the changes that come with creating sustainable solutions to the problems that we have, and they feel that there's a sort of rationing. And really the sustainability issue in my head is the end game is to ensure the well-being of humanity. And that, how you do that is a compromise between rationing the resources we're using today compared with the damage that might do in the future. So So really, that's the kind of journey I've been on, not only sort of the road trips and the sailing trips that I've been on, and I include anecdotes from those journeys, but it's also about that journey and understanding what sustainability really means. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think I've been giving talks for about 15 years, and the thing I've seen is that if there's one thing that I've noticed over those years, it's that businesses have to be dynamic to say sustainable. And there's been an evolution of what sustainable business means. I think back to, the early 2000s when I was first getting involved in these kind of discussions. And sustainability was, very well-meaning, but pretty ineffectual for businesses. It was, let's not print this unless we need to. Let's unplug phone chargers. All that. It was all good stuff, but it's, in the scheme of things, it's it's a drop in the ocean. And then there seemed to be an evolution to kind of sustainability was all about PR. So let's emphasize, the green credentials of our heavily carbonized products and services, but it's ethically knitted by vegans, and we'll put that on the label. That kind of greenwashing. That sounds like I'm being disparaging. I don't mean to be, but that kind of emphasizing of green highlights of the business without actually changing anything. The next wave seemed to be certification. So a lot of businesses moved to thinking, okay, well, how can we create an environment where it's actually advantageous for us to do the sustainable version of what we're doing. So a lot of accreditation schemes that came up. And not too long after that, it became clear that almost structurally, a lot of certification schemes have either a bias in them, or there are mechanisms to sort of circumvent the intention behind them. The next evolution, the most recent one that we're sort of coming out of now, I suppose, is ESR, this idea of having sustainability at the boardroom core of a business. And again, in theory, that should work really well. And there are businesses that have used ESR fantastically, but it's a system that now is a little bit discredited, certainly amongst investors, as a kind of greenwashing sticker that gets put on there. And I think we're moving now for businesses that want to be sustainable into a kind of pragmatic phase, where there is really a kind of a step back and a real look at, actually, let's think about sustainability and let's think about how it affects our business. There's legislative, ethical, commercial realities that businesses live in, and increasingly the sustainability aspect is front and center of those. I find it really interesting that 10, 15 years ago when I first started speaking about this, I'd be at events where I'd be the one with the beard saying, the climate crisis is going to change everything. You've got to think about sustainability. And then there'd be the guys in suits that would come on and say, no, everything's fine, don't worry about it. And the last talk I gave was an insurance event. And the roles had switched. There were the guys in suits that were saying, this totally changes how our business has to work. We have to rethink everything. And I was the one that was saying, there are solutions out there. There are ways of getting through this. So I think that dynamic is the answer to what a sustainable business looks like. I think you really have to be on your toes and ready to change. I think, again, the sort of next evolution, the thing that I've noticed happening is a real kind of broad rethink of businesses. So as an example, a business that makes widgets, it could think, well, how can we make these widgets more efficiently and more, better materials and less energy in order to make widgets, as opposed to thinking, how can I take the machinery that I've got, the staff and the skills and the plant that I've got, and use those to do something completely different. I'll give you an example. Another talk I gave a couple of years ago now, actually. It was an advertising agency. And by definition, an advertising agency is all about promoting consumption, which by definition is a kind of unsustainable concept. So the whole business idea, no matter how many times you unplug the phone charger, the whole business structure is based around promoting a kind of unsustainability. And they've recognized that. And rather than think, well, how can we do what we're still doing and change it, they thought, well, how can we take the skills that we have, which is skills of advocacy, and apply those to a sustainable end. And they'd set up a team within the advertising agency to work specifically on advocacy for sustainability at government level and at corporate level. So I think that's maybe where the next sort of wave and the next, I don't want to call it a trend because that sounds belittling, but the next kind of set of ideas that will eventually evolve into another set at some point in the future. But I think that's really where the next wave is, thinking about what do we have as a business, what are the resources that we own, and how can we put those to work to a sustainable end, rather than focusing on the historical business functions that we've done in the past. And some of those rules apply as well, not just for businesses, but for individuals. A lot of the time, the pressure to be sustainable is put on individuals, and that's a little bit of an unfair pressure because we live in an infrastructure that is inherently unsustainable. You know, our energy needs are largely come from fossil fuels, and there's not much choice in that really as individuals. And there are these kind of four things that often get cited: cars, kids, planes, and meat. These are the four things that if you can cut those out, or even just reducing them, it makes a really positive difference. But there's a, you know, that's sort of the sort of tweaking around the edges. There's a bigger picture. You know, I think a lot of people, it helps if you're in a financial position where you can make these choices, and not everyone is. But a lot of people like to sort of, I think, are starting to think about, well, actually, what am I doing with my life? How am I contributing to these kind of issues? And is there something I can take my skills and the resources I have in life and apply them in a different way, rather than the work I'm currently doing? So I'm conscious of going down that road too far, because sometimes I get branded as a demotivational speaker, where I'm sort of trying to encourage people to totally change what they're doing. But yeah, so to answer your question, dynamism, dynamic, being on your toes and being ready for change. I think that's the key thing. I think that the biggest challenge is attrition, and I think a lot of the times the sustainability question is wrapped up in kind of identity politics. That makes it sound more heavier than I mean it to be. But there's a sense of, that goes with like, we're changing something about the way we do things because of sustainability. So I think it's that attrition which is really difficult to overcome. And when you think back to, I mentioned this definition before of sustainability, the needs of protecting, securing the needs of people and future generations while protecting the needs of people today. I think that needs of people today bit often gets overlooked, not in the policies necessarily, but in the communication. And I think it's really important when you are making changes that A, you communicate this clearly, but B, you include in the policies that there is a recognition that there will be losers today in order for there to be winners tomorrow, and that there's a communication of how those losers today are actually benefiting. And maybe that's some kind of compensatory process that happens right now, or maybe it's a kind of long-term, I know this is tough this week, but look at what's going to happen in the future. So I think it's that attrition, which is quite difficult. Secondly, I'd say maybe that the clarity of direction. I think it's difficult to know, the things we think of that are, this is what you do in order to be sustainable. I'll give this example about, unplugging phones, that phone chargers. That was the thing that everybody obsessed about years ago. And now we know that actually that's just a drop in the ocean. It has a pretty meager effect. But knowing now today what change is actually going to have a really positive benefit, there's always some uncertainty about that. Maybe uncertainty about the technology, maybe uncertainty about the legislative framework that you're working in, and so that kind of nervousness about taking that step. I kind of use my examples of setting off to travel around the world as a sort of exemplar, if you like, that I really didn't know when I set off from Croydon to drive around the world in a van that I picked out of the scrapyard and was running on used cooking, or whether I'd be able to find enough fuel, whether the engine would hold together. But I think it's important to take that first step. When I was stuck in traffic driving down to Dover, it was the most unremarkable journey. Hey, I'm setting off to drive around the world. Well, I'm just stuck in traffic on the motorway here. It's not really that amazing as an experience. But I think you've got to take that first step to get to the next step, to be able to solve the next problem. So I think, you know, kind of that attrition and that uncertainty, I think those are two very real challenges that businesses face, and they're hard. And I think you've just got to, you know, take a step and get to the next bridge. Okay, so I often get booked by clients because my story is quite quirky. You know, you can imagine trying to fill up a van with used cooking oil from a crisp factory in Tehran. You know, these are kind of funny, entertaining stories, and it's a nice distraction. Often people find it really good to have me talking sort of straight after lunch to snap people out of their food coma before they go back into the meat and the content, the meat of the content of their events. I think what's really important for me is to get across the optimistic and the positive message about the direction of travel that we're on in terms of sustainability, and that change is possible and positive outcomes are happening and can happen. I think all too often, you know, the sustainability gurus, there's an element of doom and gloom and threat, and if we don't do this bad thing will happen, and they're not wrong. But I think there's another way of sort of framing that message of, you know, there are some positive things we can do that have a positive effect. I like to think I have quite a conversational style, so maybe I'm not as fluent, but I'm certainly not a sort of authoritarian speaker that, you know, pronounces this is how we do it. And I think that works well. I think big rooms end up feeling more intimate and small rooms feel more significant. So I think that works quite well. And my personal goal whenever I'm giving a talk is I like to leave clients thinking, oh, that was actually a lot more thought-provoking than I was expecting. So as I say, I tend to get booked because the stories are quite quirky and quite novel. But for me, telling the sort of jestery stories about the time I was arrested or whatever, yes, it's good fun. But actually for me, what I find rewarding about talks and sharing my thoughts on this is actually kind of giving people a new framework or a different set of frameworks, different set of perspectives to look at the issue of sustainability.